Deborah and Henry decided not to rush into having a child of their own. Deborah already had a daughter from her first marriage. Henry took great pleasure in spending time with Alice, helping her with her schoolwork and teaching her how to ride a bike. He had always dreamed of having a daughter, and he was delighted that Alice had grown attached to him, especially since her biological father, Philip, rarely visited. Trouble came unexpectedly. Deborah had been worried for a month. Alice was pale, tired easily, and even her teachers started to complain. Deborah decided to take her daughter to the doctor, hoping he might prescribe some vitamins. Instead, they were sent for a blood test. That evening, Henry returned home in high spirits, but his joy faded when he saw his tearful wife. "What happened?" he asked. Alice was diagnosed with a blood disorder. The doctor said that if it continued to progress, Alice could die. They underwent a full medical examination with numerous tests and heart-wrenching conversations with doctors, culminating in the terrifying diagnosis of leukemia. The doctor said Alice needed an operation and a course of chemotherapy, but the most crucial part was a bone marrow transplant, for which they needed a suitable donor. Most likely, cells from one of her parents would be a match. Deborah called her first husband, Philip, from home, ensuring Alice wouldn't overhear. Philip arrived the next day, pale and confused. Both parents went to have the necessary tests done. Henry insisted on being tested as well, just in case his cells were a match. A week later, Deborah went alone to get the final results. According to the data, the doctor said, if the donor is one of the parents, the chances of survival are no more than 20%. Your current husband is not a match. If you and Alice's father had another child, we could use the bone marrow from the baby. The survival rate would be much higher, almost 90%. There was a way out after all. For days, Deborah wandered around like a zombie, lost in her bleak thoughts. Another child from her ex-husband? The idea felt absurd. He had become a stranger to her. It was like conceiving with a passerby on the street, or even worse. She spent each night in the arms of her beloved husband and felt sick at the thought of another man's touch. Carrying a child from him for 9 months seemed like madness. Alice was growing weaker by the day, having to take a lot of medication. Deborah had seen enough children in hospitals to know what would come next. Alice would grow too weak to get out of bed, and one day she wouldn't be able to get up at all. When Deborah cautiously told Henry about the last meeting with the doctor, he exploded. More chances. He can't offer anything else. We'll find another doctor, we'll take her to another place for treatment. Henry slammed the door angrily. Deborah and Philip. This is crazy. He suddenly felt a pang of pity. She's completely worn out if she's suggesting this. She'll collapse if we don't find another doctor. Initially, when Deborah told Philip what could save their child, he looked at her in shock, but listened without interrupting. You know, he tried to choose his words carefully. We should look for other options, other medications. No, I'm willing to help with anything, but what you're suggesting is just madness. And what if the child isn't a match as a donor? For our daughter, this is the only chance. You can think about it, but I've already made my decision that evening. Philip spent a long time going through an album of childhood photos, deep in thought. The next day, Philip called his ex-wife. He had made his decision. They met several times at his apartment. It all felt like a bad dream they just needed to wake up from. Later, Deborah would remember it as a blur. A month later, Deborah found out she was pregnant. Throughout that month, Deborah diligently went with Henry to the doctors he found, but something strange was happening to her. She avoided eye contact as if hiding something and shied away from intimacy, claiming she wasn't in the mood. Henry was afraid to question her and hoped things would become clear on their own. And they did. Henry listened to his wife in silence. Then, without a word, he went to the next room. That night he slept there. A heavy silence settled over the house. Deborah struggled to grasp what had happened. A sense of indifference took over, and she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had been too cruel to her. Only when the baby started moving did she feel a tentative love for him. He was innocent, after all. Henry tried to come to terms with the idea that his wife was having another man's child, and gradually he managed. Alice was fading before his eyes, and he tried not to think about the rest. In early April, a healthy baby boy was born. 2 months later, the needed cells were ready for transplantation. Preparations for the operation began. The children were placed in a ward, and the necessary tests were conducted. Then, the bone marrow cells were taken from the baby. The final step was to transplant them to Alice. On that June day, everyone was at the clinic: Henry, Philip, and Deborah. It was only in the evening that a tired surgeon informed them that the procedure had been successful. Alice was on the road to recovery, though she still had to take a lot of medication and go for regular checkups. The doctor's prognosis was favorable. Her little brother was gaining weight steadily and smiled joyfully whenever he saw his mother or sister. But for Henry and Deborah, the drama continued, and no one could predict how it would end. "I understand that this isn't infidelity," Henry said. "Deborah did it to save Alice. But I can't stand the sight of this child. Every day he reminds me that my wife was with another man. And Philip, no matter how much I dislike it, will come around, see the children, and be with my wife.